A few weeks ago, we started this series called Vibes, and we talked about our vibes and emotions and how if we aren't careful, they can take control of us. And since none of us like being controlled, handling our emotions is something we want to get better at. As we continue this conversation today, we're going to be talking about the emotion of guilt. When it comes to emotions in general, we've talked about how as humans, we've learned to monitor our behavior, but the problem is that we've never really learned how to monitor our emotions, our hearts, where the emotions come from. It's important that we learn how to monitor our emotions because our emotions have a big impact on the way we treat ourselves and other people, and that is a big deal to Jesus. So I want you to think of it this way. This water bottle right here, tipping this water bottle over doesn't determine what comes out. What's already in here determines what comes out. If water is inside like there is, then water is going to come out. Shaking this, if I took the lid off right now and shook this with the lid open, that doesn't determine what comes out of here. Shaking this, all it does is it exposes what's already inside. And the same is true with our emotions. They are inside of us. The question is, how did they come out? Which is why what King Solomon said is so important in the scriptures. In the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, verse 23, he says this. He says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And so what Solomon was saying is that what's going on inside of us is important. Why? Because what comes out of us comes from our heart. And we can all try to watch our actions and monitor our behavior, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is taking care of what's inside. Because good or bad, whatever is inside is going to come out just like the bottle of water. And let's be honest with ourselves, we can all admit that we have some problems on the inside, right? Most of us can quickly think of the things that we've done, said, or thought that no one else is allowed to know about because we all have stuff inside of us that's not great. And when that stuff comes out of us and we do or say something that's not great, the result is usually a different emotion that can end up controlling us. We're talking about guilt. This is what you feel when you did something you shouldn't have done, or maybe you said something you shouldn't have said, right? It's when you hurt someone who deserved better. Feeling this legitimate guilt isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but it does become a problem when something you've done in the past becomes a part of your identity. Now, let's be clear. Nobody likes to feel guilt. And so instead of doing something about it when we feel it, we like to stuff it away. And we have messages that we say to ourselves about the thing we feel guilty about, right? Things like, I wasn't the only one, or, well, I was just going through a bad phase, or it's not my fault. And we tell ourselves these stories to make the guilt less powerful. And so we don't feel quite as bad. But here's the thing. When we make excuses for our guilt or pretend like it's not a big deal, the guilt doesn't go away. We actually end up giving our guilt more power. And we experience guilt like a weight. And when we carry around a weight, it throws us off balance. Carrying the weight of guilt throws us off balance. And the truth is, we're all guilty of something. Right? So we're all also in danger of letting our guilt become something like anger, and then our anger turning into us being defensive, right? We don't like people pointing out where we may have gotten it wrong, and there's a reason for that. If we own up to our guilt and admit that what we did wasn't okay, we'll see what we did for what it was, sin. And that leaves us feeling condemned and convicted and judged. In other words, we'll feel bad because we'll see that we did something bad and we can't undo it. We can't unsay that thing or untalk that way or untreat someone that way. And eventually we realize that even though this thing is in the past, it's not completely gone. It's still there as a part of our story. But here's the good news. You do not have to be defined by your past. And you don't have to deny it either. Jesus offers a different way. a way to no longer be controlled by our guilt, shame, or anger. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. I want to look at something that the Apostle Paul said in the Bible. Paul had more regret and guilt than all of us combined watching this. He was ashamed of his past and felt guilty because the early part of his life, before he became known as the Apostle Paul, he was known as Saul of Tarsus. And Saul spent his time hunting down followers of Jesus so that he could arrest them and have them tortured, imprisoned, or even killed. He did more than just let this happen. He made it happen. But then Paul's life changed and he became a follower of Jesus. And instead of killing Jesus' followers, he made it his life mission to encourage more people to follow Jesus. But his past was still his past. And it's likely that he had to face the families, perhaps, of people he went after before he followed Jesus. There's no question that he dealt with regret and with guilt, knowing what he had done and remembering the faces of people he had arrested or killed. But what makes his story so amazing is that he doesn't distance himself from his past. He doesn't run away from it, try to hide it, or even deny it. He doesn't make excuses like, well, that was before I met Jesus, and so it doesn't really count. Instead, he told his story and he owned it. And he wrote about it in a letter to Christians living in Rome. The book of Romans chapter 8, verse 1 and 2 says this: "Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the power of sin and death." In other words, he tells people that because of Jesus, something new happened. You don't have to pretend that you didn't do something wrong. There is freedom in owning up to God what you said or did. When you call it what it is, that weight, it comes off, right? You can stop running and making excuses. We can let go of all of that stuff and find freedom. How? Well, Paul tells us. He says in Romans 8, verse 3, he says, "For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh," ... meaning all the law could do was show us how we got it wrong. Right? It points out the ways that we've messed up, but it can't fix anything for us. It can't take that weight away, and it definitely doesn't give us freedom. But freedom can be found. And so Paul goes on and he says, "For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering." Meaning, Jesus had no guilt. Jesus did nothing wrong, right? He came and lived the perfect life, and he died a criminal's death so that we could be free. We have every reason to feel guilty, right? Jesus has none, though. And yet it's Jesus who is the one who died. And because of that, we no longer have to feel guilty. Because of Jesus, guilt does not have to be the boss of you. Because of Jesus, we can live guilt-free, right? Jesus took it all. It's like he's saying, bring all of your guilt over, all the stuff you've ever done, right? Own it, because what you did was wrong. It wasn't okay. We both agree that you messed up and are guilty. But he says that it's not the end of the story. He says, I don't see you that way anymore. And I don't want you to see yourself that way either. I want you to see yourself the way that I do. And so Paul wraps up the thought by saying this. He says, "And so he, God, condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." And so Paul here is saying God has made the relationship between you and him guilt-free. You are guilty because you did something you shouldn't have, right? We all have, but you are not condemned, right? And guilt doesn't define you anymore. What Jesus did on the cross defines you. Jesus took the guilt on himself, and now you're free. Now here's the thing. Sometimes, to be honest with you, the way that Paul writes or other authors in the Bible can be confusing. And so I don't want us to miss this because it sounds confusing. And so let me explain it in an easier way. When you decide to take God at his word, when you trust that Jesus is who he says he is and did what he said he was going to do, a few things happen. Number one, you are no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. Guilt is not the boss of you. You belong to God. And God, he says that you are not condemned, right? So when that voice of shame and guilt tries to weigh you down, you can say, Jesus took care of that for me. That's not who I am anymore. I belong to Jesus. And number two, your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. Meaning what you did doesn't disappear. Right? You may have some lessons to learn, but that thing you did, that thing that you said, it isn't who you are. Right? Let your past be the thing that marks a change in you. Let it lead you to show gratitude to God for who you are now. Number three, you don't get to condemn others for their mistakes. When we realize, right, that what Jesus has done, when you realize what he's done for your guilt, you understand that he's done the same thing for others. And so you don't get to judge, hate on, or even criticize others for their mistakes. Your past makes you perfectly positioned to love everyone else despite their mistakes. And then number four, you are free to make things right with the person you hurt without excuses or an expectation of getting something back from them. And this one here is big. Because sometimes we think that when we do something wrong, the most important thing for us to do is just pray, ask God for forgiveness and everything is fine. But it's not always fine. Jesus cares about making it right. Not just with him, but the person that you hurt as well. And so the call is to, go ahead, pray for forgiveness, but then go out and make it right with the other person. Whatever you took from them, trust, friendship, self-esteem, own it. And here's the thing. It's possible that your willingness to be humble and approach that person will do more than just keep the guilt from controlling you. It will allow them to deal with the hurt and emotion inside of them that they may not have even known that they had. In fact, what if that's the reason you're watching today? Like, what if someone is waiting on you right now to make the first move and make things right? What if that's the way forward and the way out of the weight of guilt? Don't let pride, fear, or worry be the thing that keeps you from righting the relationship. Maybe the best thing that you can do to let the guilt vibe go is humble yourself and seek forgiveness from the person that you hurt. Just maybe, I don't know, but just maybe that's why you're watching today. Now here's the thing, I get that it's scary, but remember this, as long as we hold on to the guilt, we're letting our past define us. And Jesus came to change that. Our past can remind us, but it does not have to define us. And maybe today is the day that changes for you. Maybe today is the day that you really understand that because of what Jesus did for you, you're no longer condemned. Guilt is not in control. That vibe is not going to call the shots. There's no room for the vibes of guilt and of shame, embarrassment, and pride. Because of Jesus, all of that is gone. May we remember that today and pass that same love on to others despite their mistakes. Because of Jesus, guilt doesn't have to be the boss of you, and it doesn't have to be the boss of people around you either.